This is going to be a little bit more of a difficult topic, I think. It's certainly a heavier thing to be looking at. The clean pain, dirty pain is easier to say than to actually really do. So I wanted to make it as easy on us as possible in terms of not going into feeling overpowered and shamed. And so that's kind of the feeling I had when I was starting to read Gabor Mate's new book, Myth of Normal, was that it's really heavy. There was a lot of truth telling. And how can we let that in at the same time as we work with it in a skillful way, and we don't go into a feeling of, well, there's no point. This is too overwhelming. And we see this a lot with the climate situation, the climate catastrophe. We see it with these big systems of oppression. So, in 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, a lot of people took to the streets, and there was a lot of energy around expressing solidarity and outrage. And it's hard to keep that kind of energy going. It's somewhat possible to look into, wow, this is something I'm really, really aware that this is wrong. And we become really aware of the systemic oppression and, the fact that George Floyd's murder was filmed, and the entitlement of that police officer and the casual way in which it was done, I think really shocked a lot of us into seeing what people of color know all the time through their own experience. And as a white person who cares deeply about racism and freedom and justice, it's something that is hard to work with. It's fairly easy to kind of really get into the moment, of the whole of 2020, and people were, demonstrating on the streets, and a lot of Black people then were saying, yeah, but is this going to continue? It's great that you're coming out for these demonstrations and that there's this big increase in awareness, but what's going to happen after the energy for that dies down? And so that's part of what we do on an ongoing basis, is to kind of bring ourselves back into the conversation and into the reality of, this is the system that we live in. This is the conditioning that we have. And we don't have to fall in line with our conditioning, but it's there. And that was part of what my blog was about this week, was just really tuning in. I'd known for a long time, of course, all of those things, but to put it in one place, to really look at, I was raised to be racist. And I was also raised in a very white, segregated town. The whole town wasn't white, but the area I lived in was. And it wasn't until I went to middle school or junior high that I actually even met anybody who was a person of color. So how do we go from that to seeing the systemic racism and the oppression that we have? So just to acknowledge at the beginning that this is hard, and to thank all of us and acknowledge all of us that we're here and that we're doing this practice together. And let's remember to breathe and to acknowledge the impact of this on our body and our own hearts. We're involved very deeply with this. All right, so we're going to do our inquiry. A big part of the inquiry is going to be around social location, where we really look into, where are we close to power? Where are we farther away from it? Just to kind of explore that. And I thought that might be one way that we could work with this, that would help us to not go into that feeling of, I'm the bad guy, I don't know what to do, I feel helpless, that we could actually grapple with this in a way that would be helpful. Week 1 is about how race and class get under our skin. It's wording from that section in The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture by Dr. Gabor Mate. It's a book that we're going to work with over the next several weeks. And I thought, since this is the week of truth and reconciliation with Indigenous people in Canada this week, that I thought we would start with race and class. One of the things that Gabor says right at the beginning is that he really sees that this entire epidemic of chronic afflictions, mental and physical, that beset our current moment, something is amiss in our culture. So we have this rash of ailments and chronic conditions and fibromyalgia and cancer and heart disease, all of these different conditions that we have, mental health and physical health. In our mental health, there's so much anxiety and depression. But that we have these blind spots that we can't really see the connections that bind our health to our social and emotional lives. And he finishes by saying chronic illness is not a glitch. It is a consequence of how we live. I wanted to start with some terms that he brings in at the beginning of the book as well. So self-rejection, and we would experience that partly as core deficiency beliefs and turning against ourselves, fawning to be included. Self-rejection has powerful physiological, like in our body, dimensions that pertain to every aspect of well-being. I think we can see that that's true. Biological embedding is how our social environments and experiences get under the skin, meaning into our nervous system and viscera early in life. That's a quote from Dr. Clyde Hertzman. So this biological embedding means that we're affected by our life and things that happen early in life. We talk about this a lot, that we remember all of this danger and threat that happens early in life. And early in life, we don't really have any power to control or much influence who's around us, who we're subjected to, and in particular, our caregivers or parents. It gets under our skin. Intersectionality is a term that's been around now for several years, and it's pointing to, in this situation, that it's difficult to separate the health impacts of things. So as a woman in a patriarchal system who's also a person of color in a racialized climate, being poor in this culture that worships wealth, or living as a gay or lesbian person, all of these things, oppression around those things is endemic in our society. So we have these influences on us and they stack up. So if we have a male person of color has a different experience than a woman person of color. And we can see that it just kind of makes sense to us. And then this assaulted sense of self is a strong phrase, but it's really talking about that sense, the soul of one's being is perpetually punctured, is defined by someone else. It's defined by what I'm not rather than by what I am. It's a quote from Dr. Kenneth Hardy. One of the ideas about that I was really interested in exploring is defined by what I am not. Resmaa Menakem talks a lot about the white body as the standard body. Every other body is not a white body, so it's inherently not as good. So defined by what I am not is a big part of this assaulted sense of self. How can I maintain my own authenticity and integrity in this climate that's so difficult to show up in this systemic oppression? There's a lot of statistics at the beginning of the book. A lot of the stories about this are also hard to read. In the late 1990s, there was the ACEs study that really followed people in terms of what their early traumatic experiences were in childhood and how that affected their health. So I'm not going to go into a lot of statistics here because I think it's really clear. I don't think anybody's really arguing anymore that our culture that we live in really affects our health, and the experiences that we have and the stress that we're under really affects our health. So some of this, the Black American children are 6 times more likely than non-Black kids to die of asthma. That statistic partly relates to stress, intergenerational trauma, the stress on the individual, but it also relates to what kind of medical services and what is the condition of a Black child going into a hospital or for medical care compared to a white child. So we're looking at the systemic racism that's inherent in our healthcare system, as well as the personal experience that we have. And social trauma is a huge beast to come up against. It's daunting to try and confront it. So all of us here are doing a lot of work on our own personal trauma. We're learning and experiencing what it's like to be grounded and oriented in the present moment, to be more comfortable with the energy and sensations, to dial down the amount of being hijacked. So we're working with this on an individual level, which is really, it's certainly not impossible. It's very possible to do this. And when we look at it as a whole culture, we can really see how we're all affected and how pervasive the effects of this are. Let's take a break here and take a couple of deep breaths. Breathe in. Let yourself kind of situate back into the room that you're in. You could look around the room, notice the cues of safety. And let's go into this inquiry. If you have a paper and pen, you might want to get that if you want to write down some of these things. So Michelle C. Johnson is a yoga teacher, an author. She works a lot on social justice, anti-racism training as well. And I was at a workshop with her last year where she did a practice of social location. So it's a way to reflect on the groups that we're part of. And I wanted to have a look at this just as a way to open up our experience of what is it like for me personally? What is it like for me now and socially as well as historically? What groups was I part of historically? And also, how can we mitigate, or how are the circumstances mitigated? So if we look at somebody who has a lot of money or who is famous, they have a different experience. Mark Tewksbury, the Olympian, came out as a gay man, and it certainly wasn't without cost. And it's a bit of a different environment for him compared to somebody maybe who's in a small town somewhere. The effect of money and finances has a big impact on all of us. If you have the money, for instance, Stephen Hawking had ALS and yet was able to, partly because he was so famous and such a respected scientist, that he was able to get technology that would help him to deal with his physical condition. So all of these things really interplay. And next week, we're going to look in particular at the financial systems, toxic financial systems, and how we are affected by that and what we can do to kind of work within that. All right, so these are some of the aspects of our social location. And I thought I would just kind of go through it, and then people can pick. I'll pick a couple and we can just kind of go through and how that might work. So when we're looking at somebody who has this first person at the top there is Lisa Laflamme, a journalist and a TV broadcaster, broadcast news in Canada, who was fired recently because she is older and would refuse to color her hair. And there's a lot of outrage about that. But whether we're famous and that's happening, every older person, in particular every older woman, knows the experience of being just kind of discounted. How are we seen? Our power might go up as we get older in certain circumstances, and a lot of the times our power goes down. Gender expression, sexual orientation, the impact of just feeling at odds with the heteronormativity in our culture is part of it. The risk of suicide, for instance, in young LGBTQ kids is the same as for all other teens if they have support at home, but it is 5 or 6 times greater if they don't have the support of their family. And if we look at someone like Anderson Cooper, who's a rich white male with a long history of power in the family, and he has a different experience as a gay man than somebody without that kind of power and without that kind of money. And so is able to marry and have children, just to give a sense of none of these are simple. They all interact. So race, certainly, which is something that we're kind of specifically working with today, social and economic class, whether it was our childhood or our adult class, religion, and then the ability levels that we have as well. So as you're going through these, and I'm going through these just to kind of settle into what are some that have really impacted you. So our ability level, I see this all the time. Sometimes I've talked about a family member who had severe brain damage and mental illness throughout his whole life. And his life was so changed by those things. He just wasn't able to really interact with the world in a way that other people could. And so whether we have we grew up with depression or anxiety, or we have PTSD or complex PTSD, or whether it's that we have a body that has some kind of an issue. There's maybe our hips don't work correctly, or we have an illness, we have something like that. It affects everything about us, and it also affects how people see us. And then, of course, the political system where we live. If you live in Alabama, or in Canada, that would be Alberta, you're compared to someone somewhere where it's a bit more open, a bit more social justice oriented. That's going to have a big impact. So let's settle back now, and I'm going to work with the one on race as an example, but just let yourself go to whatever is interesting to you. What, as you look at these different items, what has had the most impact, or what is currently at the top of mind for you? And let's stay really steady and grounded in our body as we're doing the practice. Notice your feet, your seat. And if you start to get really engaged with something, or it feels a bit overwhelming, it's always good to back up and just kind of come back into looking around the room, look for cues of safety, hold your own hands, do some box breathing, do some tapping. So as we're going through these, keep yourself with a foot in this moment in time. So if you were to be working with one of these, we might start with how we identify. So if I'm working with race, I identify as I'm a white person, I'm a white settler in North America. My ancestors came from Scotland, where they were being persecuted. At that time, there was probably very little awareness of what was happening with the Indigenous people. The British Crown just declared that North America was empty and open for immigration. And your experience might be similar, it might be very different. I spoke a little bit earlier about my interaction with people of other races was very limited until I was about 12, 13. And even then, there were no Black people in the town where I lived. There was one doctor from India. One family had a Chinese restaurant. Very typical for largely white settlements in the prairies in Canada. And you could look at how have these changed throughout your lifetime. Certainly my situation now is very different than it was when I was a child. The culture as a whole has changed, and also I've changed. Really stay grounded in your body. Notice what's here. You could also look at this like a map. If your age is, kind of that 40 to 60, that's or maybe 30 to 50, depending on where you live, that's a power age. A child is a lot less powerful, and so are older people are a lot less powerful. So what's your proximity to power? How are you seen based on age? We can just kind of go down the list. Okay, gender, sexual orientation, gender expression. For me, those have had a significant impact on my life. I felt like I've had to hide at times, certainly in my earlier years. I've had a lot of workplaces where I was just open and out and took the consequences of that. So if you're heterosexual and that hasn't really impacted your life that much, or in terms of race, if you're a white person and you feel like it hasn't really impacted your life directly that much, a lot of the times it's because we're closer to power. We're not on the other end of that. And what might it be like for someone who has a different location, a different social location on that? So, if we really look at one of those areas or a few of those areas where it's really difficult for us, take some time there and really notice, what impact did that have? What impact did it have when you were a child, when you were earlier in your adult life, and now? If we were to look at something like body size, whether you were considered overweight or underweight, how did that affect you as a child? So, one of the things that happens is that we have a lot of beliefs that we form based on our experiences. What were some of those beliefs? What does this reflect back about you? If you grew up poor and didn't have a lot of money in an area, especially where a lot of other people did, or maybe you were bused into a school in a different area and a lot of the kids there had more money, whatever that experience might be, or maybe you were on the other side of that, you were the one who had more money. What did you believe about yourself based on your social location? One of the impacts of being shamed for our body size or our body abilities is that we might turn against our body. A lot of women, especially, hate their bodies, but that's certainly some men do as well. What is the impact of early life now? A lot of times our experience changes over the years because we develop more agency. We're able to kind of settle more with that. And proximity to others with different social locations is interesting to look to as well. So when I was a single parent, I was really didn't have much money. I was working a lot. I always ran out of money towards the end of the month. I didn't have money really for good food. And I knew that my parents had money, not a lot, but they had enough that they could bail me out if I really got in trouble. So my proximity to that gave me a certain confidence, or I could take a little bit more risks, perhaps. So I was still struggling financially, but I knew that I had a backup there and that my experience was different than someone else's because of that. So I think what we're probably all really looking at is how complicated this is and how we are in different places in terms of proximity to power based on a lot of different elements, as are the people that we're engaged with, friends, family. So biological families might share a lot, in terms of money and culture, that kind of thing. But if you're queer in a biological family that's not accepting of that, then that's a different experience than your siblings, for instance. All right, now let's let that kind of settle here for a minute. I'll just give you another minute to kind of bring that part of it to a close. And then let's come into really connecting with ourselves. Notice right in this moment that you could breathe, maybe a deep inhale, a few long, slow exhales. It's difficult to let it in how hard life is for people who are like me and people who have different social locations than I do. So, one of the things that tends to happen is when we feel overwhelmed, kind of window of connection gets narrower. And we start to kind of hunker down and just want to protect people who are like me, or just, I don't want to know about these things that are upsetting because I care about it and yet I feel helpless about it. So, one of the things we could sit with for a moment is I am not personally responsible for systemic racism, colonialism, the patriarchy, and oppression. No one person is responsible for this system. It's also true that we benefit from those systems, from the systemic oppression of other people. And it's not our personal failing or shame that we live in a culture that has systemic oppression. So just let's sit with that for a moment. And if we're not feeling overwhelmed or like there's something really horrible about us that we are still living in this culture, then we're more likely to be able to tune into the agency that we do have. So, this clean pain, I can face what is, I can let myself care, I can broaden my circle of caring, and I can see that, in fact, I can get together with other people. And when I do, it changes the world. And we all have experience with that in different ways. One of the really simple ways right now is that we're together in community looking into this. We're not actually alone in this. Notice that by saying we're not personally responsible for the system doesn't mean that we're not personally responsible for what we do now, the actions that we can take now, the educating that we can do, however it is that we're going to accept responsibility and agency right now. Both of those are true. And then let's take a moment to look at the kind of world that I would like to live in. What would that look like? And this is something that we could work more with too. It's kind of a lot to just do in a couple of minutes. But maybe later, just to really open up your heart around that. What kind of a world do I want to live in? And then from there, we can start to think about what kind of actions can I take to bring that more into reality. Now open your eyes, look around the room, hold your own hand for a moment, take a few deep breaths. We can come back to this inquiry anytime.